Welcome to the Rights Track podcast, which gets the hard facts about human rights challenges facing us today. In Series 5, we're asking, how does tackling SDG 8.7 and the fight to end modern slavery by 2030 work with the UN's other Sustainable Development Goals to create a better and more sustainable world for us all? I'm Todd. In today's episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Katarina Schwarz, who leads our Rights Lab Law and Policy program here at the University of Nottingham, and who is helping to develop and analyze the world's first comprehensive database of the laws and obligations of all UN member states with regard to modern slavery. I'm also pleased to say that Laura Dean, Assistant Professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Millikin University in Illinois, also joins us. Laura's work is focused on public policy, and recently she's been scrutinizing human trafficking policy in Russia. Katarina and Laura are here to help us reflect on the connections between efforts to end modern slavery and the UN's Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which aims to end violence, promote the rule of law, and strengthen institutions and increase access to justice. So welcome both Laura and Katarina. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And I believe that Laura's joining us from Latvia, not Illinois, but she is actually an assistant professor at Millikin University in Illinois. So welcome to the podcast in this episode.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, lovely to be here, Todd.
So today we're really talking about this intersection between SDG 16 and SDG 8.7. And what I'm interested in exploring, of course, is law, governance, institutions, and the governance of anti-slavery more generally. So my first question really is to Katarina Schwarz, because I'm fascinated with this what I would call a long history of anti-slavery legislation and anti-slavery law. If we look at the history of slavery and anti-slavery, real legal efforts to abolish slavery, prohibit slavery, or in some ways, try to fight slavery goes right back into the 19th century. And you'll probably tell me it goes back even further. But just if I could just ask Katarina, how do you see this long history of law? Is this a progressive development of law, or is it just one, legal framework being piled on top of another? Do you think there's actually been progress in the promulgation of anti-slavery legislation?
That's a great question, Todd. And I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. And I certainly would say that the history of anti-slavery in law goes back thousands of years. And we see examples of states enacting prohibitions against various forms of exploitation, and then sometimes rolling back on those as the political context changes throughout history. But anti-slavery is really an especially interesting context to think about law, because it's one of the first, if not the first, truly kind of international effort to engage all states in a particular kind of domestic legislating, that is, legislating against slavery. And then in the history of international law, we develop from slavery through forced labor, through institutions and practices similar to slavery, to servitude, to human trafficking. And as each of these new concepts is introduced in the international legal frameworks, and then in turn in states' domestic frameworks, it starts to complicate the picture at the same time as these things overlap and relate to one another and complement each other. So in some instances, we get fragmentation and confusion because different organizations on the international stage are responsible for different forms of exploitation as they develop, and states conceptualize of those in different parts of their law. So they might, for instance, have enacted a decree prohibiting slavery, thinking that as soon as they take away the laws protecting property rights and persons, that they've effectively abolished slavery. Then they might enact a prohibition against forced labor in their labor laws, and then prohibitions against trafficking in their criminal laws. And that's not always woven together in a coherent way, despite the fact that the experience of people who are going through these forms of exploitations often do overlap. So it's a little bit of both.
That fragmentation is interesting to me because in order to legislate against something or for something, you need to name the thing that you're legislating for or against. And the naming the thing gets back to sort of definitions and concepts. And I think you put your finger on one of the issues there. I mean, it's a problem, but it's also an opportunity in the sense that this umbrella term of modern slavery includes many practices, and legislators and lawyers need to figure out what those practices are and what they're prohibiting. So what you've just mapped out there is that there have been attempts by various agencies with different agendas trying to define what it is they're trying to prohibit. Is that about right?
Yeah, and even though there are overlaps between everything, it's also important to recognize that there are distinctions and differences in the experiences of different kinds of exploitation. So the difficult task is trying to capture both the commonalities and to work towards addressing them as a cohesive unit of forms of exploitation, whilst also recognizing the differences and the particularities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, Katarina, earlier in this year, you launched a legislative database on anti-slavery legislation at the United Nations, and that's now online and available for anyone to look at. I'm just curious, what are the sort of main findings, if you will, of that research? So you have every law that's ever tried to prohibit slavery or abolish slavery, and you've looked at domestic legislation, etc. But what are sort of the key insights that you gained by doing that work?
So the big headline definitely is that the assumption that anti-slavery actors had been relying on for quite a while, for decades in fact, that slavery had already been made illegal in every country in the world, and that what we were trying to do with our anti-slavery efforts was either refine and adapt those laws to make sure they were responding to the time or addressing nuances, or we were simply focusing on implementation. But in fact, mapping the domestic laws of 193 UN member states, we start to see that that fundamental first step of actually creating the prohibition in domestic legislation hasn't actually occurred yet in many of the world's states. So in almost half of the world's states, there isn't actually a crime of enslaving another human being. And we can look at the prohibitions against forced labor, against servitude, against the four institutions and practices similar to slavery in the same way, and see that the picture is relatively similar. About half of the world's countries don't have criminal sanctions in place if you force another person to labor against their will. And very, very few states have enshrined a prohibition against servitude in their domestic law. So the basic finding really is that we've still got a lot of work to do on that basic first legislative step of making sure our laws capture these different forms of exploitation.
Yeah, so that long history of anti-slavery continues, and much work to be done. Laura, one of the things I see a lot in the sort of history of slavery and the history of modern slavery is a turning point at the end of the Cold War, and that a lot of people suggest or argue that the breakup of the Soviet Union actually threw a lot of things up into the air, not just the legal frameworks, but also really created a people on the move problem, as well as a rise in organized crime, which sort of took advantage of the opportunities of the breakup of the Soviet Union. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that history, just sort of, does the breakup of the Soviet Union create new opportunities for criminal activity? Did we see a surge in human trafficking and people on the move? One of the phrases that's used is that since the 1990s, there's been this sort of fourth wave of anti-slavery mobilization that's pinned to that breakup of the Soviet Union and the movement of people. I wonder if you could just comment on that for a starter.
I mean, migration, like most things, takes a bit of time. So it wasn't automatic in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell. And as we know, the Soviet Union fell apart in different parts. So we actually see a lot of the migration take place in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it really started with the idea of, East European looking women working in the sex industries in Western Europe. And there's actually a term coined for this type of exploited person, and it's called the Natasha. And it's similarly Slavic-looking women, with Slavic features working in the sex industries of Western Europe. And so that's kind of what really started a lot of the policy making and forced policymakers in Eastern Europe to start, a lot of these criminalization efforts in the region. So what we see today actually is kind of a different aspect of human trafficking with forced labor. So it's really similar to what Katarina was talking about. Many of them recognize sex trafficking, but then have been reticent or didn't realize that labor trafficking was a problem. Organized crime, organized crime tied with the Soviet Union is a huge issue, but I would say over time, organized crime and corruption have enveloped more in the state. And so we actually see it a lot less than we did in the 90s and 2000s, because many times those people are actually people working within the state, especially in Russia, to a lesser extent, Ukraine, now Central Asia and the Caucasus too. And so we definitely do see corruption and organized crime, but they're not players outside of the state now. They're actually players inside of the state and, kind of feeding that corruption, bribing different government officials and things like that. So in many places in the former Soviet Union, organized crime is seen as a legitimate actor.
Okay, so let's pick that apart a little bit. Another observation about the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union is that some countries in Eastern Europe looked west, and many of them became members of the European Union. Other countries looked east, or at least tried a third way. If I think about regions in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, for example. And then equally, the Russian Federation has strong political interests, certainly not only just in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also in Central Asia and in the sort of border states of Eastern Europe. We know, of course, of the Crimea situation. So, and that brings me to the question around governance and what you just mentioned in terms of the state. This interaction between the rule of law and regime type. There are varying degrees and levels of democracy. If one looks at the variety of democracies data set, for example, they talk about flawed democracies, electoral authoritarian regimes, illiberal democracy. A number of adjectives are out there to describe this phenomenon. So you have these countries looking west, and they're kind of influenced by EU policy in this area, and you have countries looking east or south or out to Asia, may have a different sort of flavor to their rule of law. Can you tell me something a little bit about the interaction between the rule of law and regime type with respect to this issue?
So I would say, yeah, I mean, we definitely do see this interaction between rule of law and regime type. But what is interesting, so I mean, conventional knowledge is that Baltic states and the rest of Eastern Europe, so like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, really started looking west after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then the rest of the countries kind of really aligned themselves in the Russian sphere of influence and kind of continued their look east. Of course, Ukraine has now, since Maidan, has begun looking east much more often. But we do see this kind of bifurcation in the former Soviet Union. But what is interesting is that I basically took all the policies on human trafficking. So I looked at not only criminalization statutes, but victim service statutes, different decrees, and basically all the legislation dealing with human trafficking in the former Soviet Union. And what I did is I actually ranked those on a scale that I created, a human trafficking policy index, to actually kind of evaluate the breadth and scope of the laws in this region. And what is interesting is that we actually don't see a breakdown by regime type in the scope of human trafficking laws. So for example, Estonia, which is one of, I think it's probably the highest in Eastern Europe in the former Soviet sphere on democracy levels. It actually has like among the worst human trafficking policy in the region. Whereas like Georgia has really great policy, Moldova also has great policy, and those are countries that are seen as leaning democratic, but not entirely democratic. And so one thing that I found in my research that's interesting is that we actually don't see, it's not like all democracies have great human trafficking policy and all authoritarian regimes have really bad human trafficking policy. We actually see kind of divergence based on regime type. So while that's just looking at policy on face value, implementation is an entirely different story. So we see democracies are better able to implement the policies, but it's interesting that actually that starting off point when we're looking at different regime types, that democracies don't always do the best and don't always score the best in the region for their breadth of policy.
That's fascinating, and that aligns with some of the work I've done in the past on just human rights in general. So I found that older democracies, the sort of, what we would call the, stable, advanced democracies, tend to ratify human rights treaties less frequently and with more reservations than newer democracies, who tend to ratify more human rights treaties with fewer reservations. And it's an interesting phenomenon. And there's a book by a scholar named Heather Smith Kanoy called Insincere Commitments, in which she looks at mostly the Central Asia region, but finds that there was a rush to ratify among post-Soviet states, to sort of gain international credibility. Perhaps even there were conditionality agreements and foreign aid and other things. So you may find this phenomenon in terms of embracing law, at least at a conceptual level, and passing lots of legislation. But then you put your finger on the problem, which is about implementation. So if I turn back to Katarina, this interaction between regime type and implementation, is there something that you have some thoughts on about this implementation gap and how that intersects with regime type?
Beginning with the caveat that Laura mentioned, which is that talking about legislation is not talking about implementation. So simply having good legislation in place doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing a good job of implementing that legislation and protecting people on the ground. But I think this point that Laura's made about essentially surprising places with good legislation is really, really important, because there are dominant narratives globally in the anti-slavery space about who's good and who's less good at tackling these problems. And sometimes when you start to do a more encompassing review of states, you actually do start to reveal that things aren't always as you would expect, and the trends don't necessarily speak in the same ways as people's assumptions do. So for instance, I always point to the fact that, the tiny island nation of Nauru has this really interesting criminal provision dealing with slavery that translates the international definition into its domestic law in a way that very few states have done. And no one would ever think to look at Nauru as an example of how you might approach criminal legislation. And the other thing I wanted to just note is that there are other sorts of trends as well, which is not just about whether or not states have made commitments or enacted legislation, but how they do so and where they do so. So we see some interesting geographic regional trends, for instance, when we're looking globally at legislation, that isn't about whether or not states are enacting legislation, but how they do so. So for instance, Latin American and Caribbean states are much more likely to enact constitutional prohibitions against slavery, servitude, and forced labor than Western European states. So we get some other interesting trends that are about how they go about dealing with these problems and not just about whether they are.
Quite apart from regime type, then, in your mind, what makes for good anti-slavery implementation? What does it take? So regardless of regime type, laws have been passed, there's a gap. How is that gap transcended through governance?
That is such a complicated question, Todd, and I'm not sure if I can ever give a satisfying answer. But I think the important thing that I would at least highlight is that it's about multiple different pieces of a governance puzzle fitting together. So it's not just about states enacting a criminal law and then having their police go and arrest people and prosecute them and convict them and put them in jail. It's about criminal justice mechanisms working together with mechanisms that protect people, working together with mechanisms that address the socioeconomic drivers of exploitation, is addressing bribery and corruption to make sure that people have access to justice when they experience violations, and a whole raft of other things. But I think the access to justice question is really fundamental, in that if you don't have any way to pursue redress when you suffer a violation, then legislation is meaningless.
If I could go back to Laura, then you started your comments talking about the sort of nascent phases of organized crime and slavery activity around sexual exploitation. But clearly, listening to Katarina, there's a broad panoply of other practices out there that fit under this umbrella concept. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about beyond sexual exploitation, what were the sort of trends that you see in post-Soviet countries, and equally, what was the geography? Are there sort of typical types of exploitation in certain geographies in the region, or is this there's just a mismatch of all sorts of stuff going across the region?
Sure. Can I go quickly back to the implementation question, actually, because I have a chapter on this. So when we look at implementation and if it's effective, a lot of the measures are looking at output. So they're looking at number of criminal arrests, or they're looking at numbers of victims rehabilitated, right? And so I don't actually think implementation is that simple of an answer. And so in my book, I talk a little bit about, and I actually interview stakeholders. I look at how policy is implemented on the ground, and actually think the policy processes and actually the implementation process with many street level bureaucrats is much more important than these outcomes that you see. So for example, I did case studies so I went on the ground in Latvia, Ukraine, and Russia. And when you look at the numbers, Ukraine Ukraine has one of the best, they rehabilitate some of the highest number of victims. And then they also are less effective at arrest, right? So if we just look at the numbers, we would think Ukraine is doing an amazing job. But when you actually go on the ground, you find a lot of issues with implementation. You find a lot of, street level bureaucrats that aren't necessarily aren't necessarily referring people to victim services and things like that. And so that's one thing that I kind of try to urge people in trafficking research is that, it's great to look at these numbers on the outside, but you don't actually know the full story unless you go on the ground and talk to policymakers and talk to these stakeholders and find out how they work with these laws. Because again, yeah, you can have the best legislation in the world, but if you don't actually implement it, then what's the point of actually having that legislation? So
Yeah, and there are raging debates about this going on in the United Kingdom at the moment. The Modern Slavery Act from 2015 has this provision called the National Referral Mechanism, and we find that some victims, avail themselves of that service, or they do it for a while and drop out. They go through it the whole way, or they don't take it up at all. And getting good numbers on who's going through that system is very, very challenging. Certainly, a topic here in the Rights Track has always been around how do we quantify some of these things, and also what's a signal of success in a way. But equally, if I could get back to this question of geography, you just traipsed through quite a few countries there in your answer. I'm just curious about the distribution of practices by geography. I don't know if that's something that you could comment on for.
So in the region in the 90s and 2000s, it was much more of a sexual exploitation, much more of a focus. And it's interesting because when you look at the laws in the region, a lot of the laws beyond criminalization statutes, so the victim services provisions, really only provide for female victims of sex trafficking. And that's just not what we see anymore. In Central Asia, we see by far more victims of forced labor. Many times, especially in Uzbekistan, we see it in the cotton industry. We see lots of people in Central Asia, they're big sending countries to Russia. So we see a lot of males being exploited for forced labor in Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, people used to go to Ukraine as well. So those are really big destination countries for victims of forced labor. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's this regional stereotype in the post-Soviet region of Natasha, similar looking women with Slavic looking faces, but that's not actually the victim that we see most often today. So before the war and situation with Ukraine, Russia was the second biggest country in the world for migration after the United States. Now it's the third after Germany, but still we're seeing lots of push and pull factors within the region. And we don't actually see policies that are responsive or open to working with male victims of trafficking. Many of them, in fact, only say that they work with victims. There are lots of rehabilitation centers that will only work with female victims. And so we're seeing, male forced labor victims being exploited in Russia and then going back home and then entering into exploitative relationships again because there's because they really have never received any sort of rehabilitation services. And so we see a continuation of the trafficking cycle in that region because of the lack of services. And that really, I think, starts with the fact that a lot of the governments don't recognize that human trafficking can happen to forced labor victims that are men and children.
If I look at all of this, and if we get this back to the SDG agenda, the SDGs are, they come together at UN level. There's a general sort of iterative process that generates these by consensus. They articulated in 2015 and there are target dates and other things, etc. So at the very high intergovernmental level, you have a pronouncement of goals that ought to be achieved. But if I look at the full picture, this does appear to look like what Gary Marx calls multi-level governance, in the sense that you have this supranational intergovernmental level that it includes the sort of EU, the UN, and other regional bodies, etc. And then a step down for that, you have this kind of transnational level, which involves advocacy groups, NGOs, and others, and then a domestic level that involves states, etc. And there's also a division, I think, between the public and the private. So public organizations like states, intergovernmental organizations, etc., have an obligation to pursue this agenda, but equally private sector, certainly in the area of modern slavery, have an obligation as well. Less legally binding, Katarina would probably say, but you have multinational corporations, you have domestic firms of different sizes, and legislation that says you too have an obligation to look at your supply chains, look at this, look at those practices. And I think it goes back to what both of you said. Katarina mentioned different drivers, socioeconomic factors. Laura mentioned push-pull factors, socioeconomic dimension, etc. So just your final reflections, and it's a very fragmented, somewhat coordinated, but also there's a problem of collective action around a governance model that would fit. If we're really talking about the governance of anti-slavery, Just some parting comments from both of you about how this can be joined up better. So if I could turn to Katarina first, and then go to Laura.
I think part of it is exactly what I was saying, is recognizing that these things do overlap and that there are connections, and fundamentally a lot of these practices are about commodifying human beings, treating them as if they're property or things that you can exploit as you like. And that's at the core of this, and something we are all trying to address, but also recognizing the particularities of different kinds of exploitation. Laura was talking about this kind of ideal victim that we have in our minds of the female sexually exploited, coerced Eastern European victim. And this actually traces back through the entire history of human trafficking, which started off in international law as the white slave trade and was concerned about white Western European women forced into sexual exploitation transnationally, and closed off avenues of looking for other kinds of victims, and also stops us from looking at the complicated cases as equally problematic as those more simple cases of innocent people forced into exploitation. So grappling with the complexities, with the fact that sometimes coercion is not going to look as simple as someone was physically forced and abused into a situation. Sometimes psychological coercion is complicated. Sometimes social conditions and structural factors are playing a part in someone's situation. And trying to marry each different level of governance, and also not just these different levels of the supranational, the transnational, and the domestic, but different spheres of governance in those spaces. So when we're looking at domestic law, we have to be bringing together labor regulation and immigration regulation and criminal law and victim protection frameworks and human rights, and figuring out how to make those work cohesively in favor of victims. And from a legal perspective, sometimes that's about picking and choosing in the moment, but it's also making sure that those things all work together. I fear that's not a particularly satisfying answer, but hopefully it will do for now.
It's a remarkably realistic and pragmatic answer. Laura, what are your thoughts on this question?
So I study, how these institutions make policies and then how they actually implement them. And so I think it really all comes back to the strengthening of institutions, right? So you can't really have rule of law if you don't have institutions set up to actually implement that law. And so a lot of times we see governments with anti-trafficking institutions. First, they'll, enact a criminalization legislation, and then they'll get, they'll get policing units that work with human trafficking, right? And many times governments will stop there, building the institutions that will actually go after traffickers and help victims. But I think that they need to go beyond that. They need, victim services statutes. They need different types of rehabilitation centers. They need, a system to actually recognize and give assistance to those victims. And so I think that if they strengthen institutions, strengthen the state capacity, then rule of law and actually implementing these policies will be a bit more effective. So I think, so what I found is even in authoritarian regimes, we see people actually influencing the state. And so by enacting and helping with the capacity of the state and the commitment of the state, I think that we will actually see, a more effective policy, and we'll actually see rule of law in many countries that, don't have, problems with that. We might see them, better implementing different aspects of human trafficking. So I think it all comes back to this idea of strengthening institutions and strengthening the capacity of the state, which can be problematic because in many countries of the world, when we talk about strengthening the capacity of the state, we're talking about strengthening authoritarianism, right? So that can definitely be a problematic element. But if we truly care about helping victims and things like that, then we need to strengthen different institutions that will help facilitate the rehabilitation of these victims, right, in victim services and rehabilitation centers.
So those are amazingly robust answers to what I admit was a very difficult question. So in closing, I think this has been a fascinating discussion with the two of you, and we've recognized the changing shape in the world. There are more states in the world. The breakup of the Soviet Union actually led to a growth in the number of states. And yet through that changing sort of tectonic plates of history, we see that vulnerable people remain vulnerable, and there may be newly vulnerable people created out of that system of changing states and changing history. But equally, there's a changing, it seems to me, structure of incentives that encourages criminal activity. And it's very clear from what you were all saying that the attempt through a governance framework, through passage of law, but also strengthening of institutions and really raising state capacity, is an attempt to constrain the agency of key actors. And those actors are state and non-state actors. I think it's really important that we absolutely recognize that there are state perpetrators, if you will, as well as there are non-state perpetrators. And yet the number of victims does continue, and that efforts to address the lives of these victims must continue as well. So it's a fascinating illustration of how SDG 8.7 intersects with SDG 16, and I hope that this discussion moves the agenda forward. So for now, I just want to thank both Laura Dean and Katarina Schwarz for their incredibly insightful comments and observations about this conundrum of governance of anti-slavery on this episode of The Rights Track. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Rights Track, which was presented by Todd Landman and produced by Chris Garrington of Research Podcasts. You can find out more about Laura's book, Diffusing Human Trafficking Policy in Eurasia, at bristoluniversitypress.co.uk, and about our podcast at rightstrack.org. Funding for this series comes from the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab project, home to the world's leading contemporary modern slavery experts and first large-scale research platform for ending modern slavery.